My folks think a $2 million penthouse is just a wedding present, a bubble to be passed down from one child to another, a line item in a family obligation ledger. They had no idea that their greed would be the last mistake of their life, the ultimate transaction in a long line of emotional withdrawals. That day, standing in the glittering ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, they learned a difficult lesson, carved in the mute, gaping lips of 500 guests. Some things are not for sale, and some scars, once inflicted, never completely heal. The echo of that slap was more than just the sound of a hand hitting a cheek. It was the sound of a family disintegrating, the final, piercing crack before the entire facade crumbled. My name is Jason, and this is my true tale. The view was the point. It has always been. From my living room, 60 stories high, Central Park was more than simply a rectangle of green. It was a living, breathing tapestry that varied with the seasons. It was the flaming blaze of fall, the stark, skeletal beauty of winter, the colorful explosion of spring, and the deep, hazy green of a summer afternoon. It was a continual, lovely reminder of what I had created. Not the penthouse itself, the glass and steel were merely a container, but the life that made it possible. I worked hard for what I own. That is a common cliché, but for me, it was the exact truth. 10 years of relentless, 18-hour days filled by cheap coffee and the kind of insane optimism that only a 22-year-old with nothing to lose can muster. I started my IT company, a data security firm, with a server rack humming in my tiny studio apartment, the heat from which was a constant, unpleasant presence during the summer. I recall eating ramen noodles for dinner, not as a sentimental college throwback, but because it was all I could afford after paying my sole employee. I recall the gut-wrenching terror of payroll, hoping that a client's check would clear on time. I recall the first large deal, the one that made me feel like I could finally breathe, and the first time I ordered a pizza with more than one topping without feeling bad about it. That grind, that sacrifice, was all baked into the walls of this building. For me, the penthouse was a sign of survival rather than luxury. It was a vow I made to myself on a particularly dark night, sitting on the fire escape of my studio apartment and gazing out at the distant, sparkling skyline. I told myself that one day, instead of looking up at the city, it would be set out in front of me. The environment was modern, with clean lines and minimalist furniture, but it was not sterile. It was my home. Framed images sat on the bookshelves, snuggled amid books on software architecture and biographies of industry leaders. My sister Sarah and I were children. A photo of us on a rusty swing set, both lacking front teeth and laughing like fools. Another from her college graduation, me with my arm thrown around her shoulder, beaming with pride. She was the only person in my family with whom I had a genuine, uncomplicated relationship. She was my anchor. My parents' portraits were modest and confined to a side table. They came from a period when I thought their concept of family was the only one that existed. Previously, I realized that their affection was conditional and transactional. They called it worry, and I called it prying. Dinners at their Westchester home had become a predictable, tense ritual. Their house was the polar opposite of mine, packed with mahogany furniture, heavy draperies, and the oppressive weight of expectation. "Jason, why aren't you married yet?" My mother, dying, would inquire, dabbing her lips with a linen handkerchief. It was not a question, it was an indictment. All your friends have families. Mark Bellows just had his third. And you live alone in that giant apartment. My father, Robert, would say, his voice a low moan of disgust. "It's not right. It's a waste of space. A man with your wealth should be settling down, building a legacy." A legacy. To them, legacy was not the company I'd started from scratch and created jobs for over 200 people. It was not the philanthropic work I did. It was a wife, 2.5 children, and a portfolio that suited their social goals. "Mom, Dad, I'm focusing on my company," I'd say, the phrases smoothed down by repetition. "I'll find someone when the time is right." I'd try to maintain an even tone to avoid giving them the gratification of a reaction. Sarah would try to mediate, using her voice as a gentle buffer between their sharp edges and my mounting animosity. "They're just worried about you, Jay," she'd say, sending me a sympathetic glance across the polished dining table. But they weren't concerned. Worry is asking, "How are you? Are you happy? Are you sleeping enough?" Their queries were always, "What do you have? Who are you with? Why aren't you more like us?" They never mentioned the stress of operating a business, the long hours, the great strain. They only saw the end result. The penthouse, the stories in business publications, the apparent status, and wanted to know how they might improve it to fit their story. My achievement wasn't mine, it was a family asset that they felt entitled to manage. The dinners always ended the same way, with me driving back to the city, the stillness of my car a welcome respite, and the flashing lights of Manhattan a beacon of the life I had carved out for myself, a life that felt increasingly distant from them. The concept for the penthouse as Sarah's wedding gift began as a joke. My mother referred to it as a family joke, which was code for an uncomfortable suggestion she could pass off as humor if she received any pushback. It initially surfaced a few months before the wedding at one of our tense Sunday dinners. You know, Darling began swirling the wine in her glass. That apartment of yours would be the most incredible start for Sarah and David. Can you imagine? I laughed it off. It's a little big for two people, don't you think? Besides, I'm kind of attached to it. Oh, you and your jokes, she answered, but her smile did not extend to her eyes. The joke reappeared every few weeks, with less humor and more steel. It became a recurring theme, a steady, low-grade pressure. I assumed that was just another of their strategies, another way to poke me and remind me that what was mine was, in their eyes, ultimately theirs to distribute. I never thought they'd be serious. I never imagined the extent of their entitlement. That illusion crumbled the night before the wedding. We were at the rehearsal dinner, which was held in a special, lavish room at the plaza and likely cost more for one night than my first apartment did for a year. The air was dense with the fragrance of flowers and costly perfume. Laughter and polite talk echoed around me, but I felt a familiar knot tighten in my gut. As soon as I was alone, my folks cornered me near the bar. "Son, we need to talk about Sarah's wedding gift," Robert said, his tone leaving no space for disagreement. "I already took care of it," I explained, trying to keep my voice light. "I gave her a generous check. She and David can use it for an epic honeymoon, or a down payment on a place of their own. It's their choice." My mother's face turned sour, as if I had offered them leftovers from the table. "A check," she mocked, lowering her voice to avoid being overheard. "Jason, that's not a gift. That's a transaction. This is your sister, your only sister." "It's a very generous transaction," I replied, my patience fraying. "You have so much," she said, her gaze roaming over me, examining my suit and watch as if she were taking inventory. "This penthouse. It's too big for one person. It's ostentatious, really. It would be a perfect start for Sarah and David. A real family gift. It would show everyone how much you love her." The tone had changed. The sense of comedy was vanished. This was not a suggestion. It was a demand wrapped in the language of familial love and obligation. They were not asking. They were telling. They actually believed they had the authority to give away my home, the physical representation of a decade of my life, as if it were a spare set of crockery. My gaze shifted from my mother's harsh, expectant expression to my father's austere mask of entitlement. In that instant, I saw them for who they actually were, emotional brokers striving for a better deal, a more advantageous position. "No," I replied. The word was mild, but it hit the space between us with the force of a stone. "That's not happening. The conversation is over." I turned and walked away, leaving them standing by the bar, shocked and furious. I realized I hadn't finished the conversation. I had just fired the first gun in a war I had no idea I was going to wage. The wedding day started bright and clear, like one of those wonderful New York fall days. The reception took place at the plaza's grand ballroom, which felt more like a palace than a hotel due to its rich history and luxury. Crystal chandeliers the size of small vehicles hung from the frescoed ceiling, pouring warm, golden light over the sea of visitors dressed in tuxedos and gowns. A live band performed softly in the corner, creating a lovely hum beneath the chatter and laughter. I tried to enjoy it. I actually did. For Sarah's sake. She looked radiant and truly pleased, and her husband, David, appeared to be a kind guy. He looked her with genuine adoration. I wanted this day to be ideal for them, but a sense of dread coiled in my stomach. A low-level thrum of apprehension that had been with me since the previous night. I kept my distance from my parents, circulating and conversing with old acquaintances and family members while maintaining a fixed, cheerful look on my face. It could not last. Midway through the reception, as I caught up with my college roommate, I felt a firm hold on my arm. My mother's grin was brittle and pasted on. My father stood directly behind her, a silent, powerful shadow. "Jason, darling, come with us for a moment," she requested in a syrupy sweet voice. She drew me away from my companion with force that belied her petite stature, pulling me into an empty passage just off the ballroom. The sounds from the celebration became muffled and distant. "The photographers are here. The moment is perfect," she added, cutting to the chase. Her eyes gleamed with burning intensity. "We want to announce the gift now." A frigid wave swept over me. "What gift?" I said, my voice lifeless. "I already told you no. We are not having this discussion again." "Don't be difficult, Jason," my father mumbled as he stepped closer. "It's for the family. It makes us all look good. We've already spoken to a few of the guests, told them you were planning a big surprise. Everyone is excited. Sarah deserves this. After everything we've done for you, you owe her this." They were deceiving me. It was a classic maneuver from their playbook. Portray their outrageous demand as a fair expectation, and my refusal as a character fault, a manifestation of selfishness. They had preceded the room with gossip, creating a web of social pressure that was impossible to escape. This was not a request, but a public trap. I simply shook my head in a silent, final denial and turned to walk back into the ballroom. My objective was to find Sarah, warn her, and stop this before it burst. But they were faster. They flanked me and herded me to the head table, where Sarah and David were sitting. "Don't you want to see your sister happy?" Diane asked quietly, loud enough for the guests at the neighboring tables to hear. Her hand rested on my back, a motion that appeared reassuring but felt like a vice. "We've already told the MC. It's happening. Go on, get on the stage with us. Don't make a scene." I came to a sudden stop. "Mom," I whispered, my voice low and chilly as a warning. "If you dare." They ignored me. As if I hadn't spoken, they walked past the head table and up the few stairs to the stage, where the band had just ended a song. The MC, a suave man with a trained smile, approached them with a microphone. "And now, ladies and gentlemen," his voice roared across the speakers. "A very special announcement from the proud parents of the bride, Robert and Diane Parker." A polite wave of applause spread around the room. I stood motionless on the floor, my heart thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. I could feel hundreds of eyes on me. Sarah looked over at me with a bewildered but glad expression on her face. She assumed this was something beautiful and planned. Diane took the microphone, beaming at the audience like she was winning an honor. "Thank you all for coming here to celebrate our beautiful daughter, Sarah, and our wonderful new son, David," she said, her voice brimming with fake passion. "We are so happy for them as they start their new life together. And to help them on their way, to celebrate this beautiful union, our son, Jason, has decided to give them the most incredible gift." She paused for dramatic effect, sweeping the room before focusing straight on me. In that instant, I knew. The dread in my stomach turned to ice. "He has given them his amazing penthouse in Manhattan as their wedding gift." A wave of oohs and ahs, interspersed with sporadic applause, swept across the crowd. People were turning in their chairs to look at me, smiling and impressed. Sarah's jaw dropped, her eyes widened in surprise, then a gradual, lovely grin appeared on her lips. She assumed it was real. I strolled to the stage, as if through water. I reached my mother just as she was returning the microphone to the MC. "What did you do?" I said, my voice barely audible amidst the throng hubbub. She leaned in close, her smile unwavering, but her eyes were like ice. "What's a little white light for family?" she muttered, her voice caustic. "Your sister deserves it. You can afford it. Now smile, everyone is looking." Something inside of me cracked. The part of me that had spent years appeasing them, accepting their manipulations, suppressing my rage for the sake of a fragile peace simply fled. It was replaced by an unsettling, unnerving stillness. I took a step forward, my voice clear and steady against the crowd's murmuring. "That's not true." The room became slightly quieter. Everyone seemed perplexed. I raised my voice to ensure everyone could hear. "I did not give away my penthouse. I am not giving away my penthouse." I turned to face the guests, my demeanor blank. I am a little confused as to why my parents would say that. A simultaneous gasp took the breath from the ballroom. The hush that followed was utter and profound. The band abruptly ceased its performance. Waiters stopped mid-stride. Every single eye was fixed on our family, creating a horrific scenario on stage. My father's face turned scarlet with fury and embarrassment. He grabbed my arm. "Jason, we'll talk about this later," he snarled. I pulled my arm away. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," I told the audience, my voice ringing with authority they'd never heard before. "Please, enjoy the party. And congratulations to my sister." Diane stepped off the platform, her face a mask of utter rage. The lovely mother persona had faded, revealing the snake beneath. She approached me, her shoes clicking like bullets on the gleaming floor. "You embarrassed us," she seethed, her voice a low, seething whisper that was more terrible than a scream. "In front of everyone! Our friends! Our family!" Then she raised her hand. I saw it coming but did not flinch. I did not move. I just stood there and observed what happened. Slap. The sound was astonishingly loud in the otherwise silent room. It was piercing, unconclusive. It echoed off the lofty ceilings, an unusual sound for a place of joy. My head snapped to the side, and a hot, searing itch appeared on my cheek. Sarah let out a choked sob. David went to her side, his face blanched from astonishment. The guests simply gazed, jaws gaping, paralyzed in collective disbelief. They had just witnessed something raw, real, and brutal, a fracture in the Parkers' immaculate mask of prosperity and happiness. I gently turned back to face my mother. I met her gaze. In mine, there was nothing. There is no anger. There were no tears, no pain. Only a wide, chilly, empty indifference. The son she knew, the one who would bend, shatter, and absorb her cruelty, had died in that moment. I didn't say anything. I simply turned my back on her, my father, and the debris of my sister's wedding reception. I walked out of the ballroom, leaving the silence and guilt behind me. The massive doors slid shut, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely alone and free. The cool night air hit me like a chilly splash, a welcome relief from the ballroom's oppressive atmosphere. I strolled down the plaza's steps, oblivious to the doorman and the remaining tourists. The city lights blurred around me. My cheek throbbed with a dull, repetitive agony that served as a physical anchor to the emotional upheaval that had just happened. I did not hail a taxi. I simply walked, my footsteps echoing on the sidewalk, putting space between myself and the existence that had just crumbled. I ended up in a beautiful, black limousine that I had pre-booked, not out of foresight, but just because it was one less thing to worry about. I slid into the smooth leather of the back seat, the engine's gentle hum a relaxing salve. The driver, a discreet professional, said nothing and simply followed his instructions to drive me home. I sat in the dark, the city's neon brightness flooding over me in waves of color. I touched my cheek. It was sore and swollen, but the physical discomfort was insignificant. It was a footnote. The real damage was deeper, a clean, precise incision through the fundamental concept of family. The slap was not an attack. Rather, it was the final punctuation mark of a long, terrible sentence. It was the receipt for a lifetime of conditional affection, where I was valued for what I had rather than who I was. I did not shout. I did not cry. Tears were not appropriate for the magnitude of the emotions. It was the kind of pain that consumes everything else, leaving only a harsh, unwavering certainty. The awareness that I had surrendered my life, soul, and a sizable amount of my fortune to a family that would sell me out for a public show, a short moment of social success. I took out my phone. My hand was completely steady. I browsed through my contacts, past my sister's name and my father's, until I located the phone number I was looking for. I pressed the call button. It rang twice. "Miller," a rough voice replied. "Hello, Detective Miller. It's Jason Parker." Detective Miller was an old acquaintance whom I had met while doing pro bono data security work for the NYPD. A good dude. A straight shooter. "Jason, everything all right? It's late. I need to report a felony." I replied, my voice cool, measured, and free of emotion. There was a pause at the other end. "Okay. Are you in danger?" "No," I said, peering out at the passing lights in Times Square. "It's not for me. It's for my parents." The following several days were a whirl of cold, harsh truth. I met with Detective Miller in a sterile, windowless room at the precinct, the air smelling of stale coffee and disinfectants. I told the entire storing months of pressure, the showdown at the rehearsal dinner, and the public announcement at the wedding, which was essentially an attempt to cheat me of a multimillion-dollar asset through public compulsion. I assumed I had a case. Fraud, conspiracy, or anything. I had 500 witnesses at the event. Miller listened patiently while taking notes. However, as I finished, he groaned and leaned back in his chair. Jason, I believe you. Every word. What they did was monstrous. But from a legal standpoint, he trailed off, shaking his head. We can't prosecute them for fraud because there's no contract, no signed document. They can and will claim it was all a terrible misunderstanding, a joke that went horribly, horribly wrong. Their lawyer will paint you as an oversensitive son who flew off the handle and embarrassed them. In a court of law, it becomes a messy he said, she said family drama, and with their resources and their high-priced legal team, it's a case that would be thrown out before it even saw a co-defeated. I left the police station and went immediately to my lawyer's office, a glass and mahogany high-rise. My lawyer, Arthur Vance, a shark who had handled all of my company contracts, heard the same scenario and delivered a similar conclusion, albeit at a higher cost. The only legal path forward is a civil suit. He continued, resting his fingertips on his large desk. You could sue them for defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress. But Jason, you need to understand what that means. It would take years. The discovery process would be brutal. They'd dredge up every aspect of your life. They'd countersue. It'd be a public, ugly war of attrition. They could drag it out for a decade, bleeding you dry in legal fees. Even if you win, and that's a big if, the damage to your reputation, I stepped out of his office and back into the anonymity of the city. The system, the very foundation of justice I had trusted, was helpless. My parents were too wealthy, connected, and crafty. They had built their existence on plausible deniability, operating in the gray areas where social cruelty was not punishable by law. They understood exactly how far they could push, and they had backup plans in case they went too far. I recognized then that I was fighting a war against my own blood, one that I couldn't win using traditional methods. The law could not aid me. The cops couldn't help me. I was alone. If I wanted justice, I'd have to make it myself. I had to choose a different course, a darker one. That night, as I sat in my living room, the city lights stretched out before me like a carpet of scattered diamonds. For hours, I didn't move. I merely stared. The view that had previously given me great pride now seemed like a farce. It was the prize for a game I hadn't realized I was playing. Something changed within me at that point. It wasn't a conscious decision or a single moment of choice, but rather a gradual, tectonic realignment of my psyche. The anguish, astonishment, and pain began to chill and harden, transforming into something else. Something frigid, piercing, and painfully clear. In that moment, peering into the depths of my own reflection in the floor-to-ceiling glass, I let go of the man I once was. The nice and forgiving son. The patient and understanding brother. The man who believed in second chances and the inherent goodness in others. I let him die. The victim has died. The hunter was born. For the next few days, I did not leave the penthouse. I didn't answer my phone, which was ringing constantly with calls from Sarah, my aunts, and anxious friends who had watched the catastrophe. I let them all go to voicemail. I required isolation. I needed to think. I was no longer a son crying over a destroyed home. I was a campaign strategist. My home office, which was once a hub for creativity and invention, has been transformed into a war zone. I applied the full force of my brain, the same obsessive focus that had established my company, to a new project, the complete demolition of Robert and Diane Parker. I began with what I knew in their finances. As their son, I was familiar with their interests, assets, and income streams. But I needed more. I needed everything. I engaged a private investigator, a former financial crimes detective known for being both quiet and thorough. I didn't want dirt in the classic sense, affairs or personal vices. I sought financial vulnerabilities. I wanted to know about every shell corporation, offshore account, dangerous investment, and amount of leverage they were carrying. While he looked into their past, I focused on their future. I resumed attending tech conferences and industry galas, but with a new purpose. Before, I traveled to network, learn, and expand my business. Now I went to perform. I put on the mask of a successful, trouble-free CEO. I laughed at the correct jokes, shook the right hands, and spoke confidently about my company's future. But my eyes were continuously scanning, and my mind was constantly calculating. I was witnessing my parents' world from the inside, learning the rhythms of their social circle and comprehending the currency they used, not just money, but perception, reputation, and gossip. Late at night, I'd return to my apartment, remove the mask, and work. I covered a large whiteboard in my office with intricate financial charts, creating a web of relationships between my parents and their brokers, banks, and business partners. I planned out their greed. It was a concrete object, a predetermined algorithm of want and ego. They were arrogant, overconfident, and always looking for the next big, showy thing that would boost their prestige. Their greatest strength, riches and social standing, also proved to be their greatest weakness. And I knew just how to use it against them. They'd always chastised me for not being more like them, shrewd, calculating, and cold. So I decided to give them exactly what they requested. I'd become the son they'd always wanted, and I used that persona to destroy them. My project was not motivated by fury, but by a cool, clear-eyed yearning for poetic justice. It needed to be classy. It needed to be precise. And it had to be a trap that they would gladly, even eagerly, fall into. I wouldn't ruin them. I'd set up the ideal conditions for them to ruin themselves. My parents' greed was as predictable as gravity. They were fixated on the next big thing, the ground floor investment that would not only increase their wealth, but also earn them bragging rights at their country club. They regarded themselves as astute investors, but in reality, they were simply gamblers with a big line of credit, motivated by a fear of missing out. This would be their downfall. I invented a ghost. I created a phantom corporation called Horizon Tech. The name was perfect. It suggested a limitless future and a fresh dawn of technology. It was unclear enough to be intriguing, yet impressive enough to sound credible. I spent several weeks creating its mythology. I purchased a domain and hired a top-tier web designer to create a sleek, professional-looking website filled with impressive but ultimately meaningless corporate jargon about synergistic AI integration and decentralized data paradigms. I created a team of executives with fake LinkedIn profiles and impressive resumes from rival tech firms. I even wrote a sophisticated, multi-page white paper about Horizon's fictitious flagship project, a technology so groundbreaking and intricate that it was nearly difficult to disprove. It was a masterpiece of corporate fiction. The next stage was baiting the hook. I could not approach them directly since they would be suspicious. The information had to come to them naturally, via the channels they trusted the mosting, gossip, and the illusion of insider knowledge. I began releasing information about Horizon Tech into the financial ecosystem. I did it through carefully selected third parties, including a tech blogger I knew and a venture capitalist with whom I had a passing connection. I made it sound like a top-secret initiative, a stealth firm ready to alter the world, with my own company as a possible big investor or acquisition. The objective was to associate my name with it. They believed in my accomplishment, even if they disliked it. My imagined engagement would provide the legitimacy they required. The private investigator I hired had supplied a wealth of information. He confirmed that my parents mostly hired one financial advisor, Gregory Finch, who was renowned as a sycophant rather than a thinker, always eager to please his wealthy customers with fresh ideas. Finch was my major aim. I organized a chance encounter. I knew Finch frequently at lunch at a certain high-end restaurant in Midtown. I reserved a table nearby for a meeting with a trustworthy colleague who knew about the plot. We shouted loudly, just loud enough to be heard, about Horizon Tech's enormous potential. I dropped numbers. Exaggerated values, incredible growth expectations. I described it as a once-in-a-lifetime experience that was really exclusive. The pre-launch phase is where the real money is. I told my colleague, knowing Finch was listening. But the buy-in is limited to a very small, private circle. Friends and family mostly. It was the perfect bait. A few weeks later, the pie confirmed that the fish was on the line. Finch had pitched Horizon Tech to my parents as a rare, off-market opportunity. My father, Robert, fell for it. His ego wouldn't let him think that his own son was involved in anything he didn't know about. The final element of the trap was a tight call, a well-executed theatrical moment. I needed to strengthen their belief, to move them from interest to obsession. I knew they frequently dined at a particular French restaurant on the Upper East Side. The PI had a waitress on his payroll who notified him every time they made a reservation. I received the call on Tuesday night. I planned to meet a potential investor. Actually, an actor I had hired. At the same restaurant. We were sitting at a table near my parents. They noticed me, of course. I gave them a brief, frigid nod and then purposely ignored them, focusing solely on my investor. Robert, bless his predictable heart, could not resist. He made a show of going to the restroom, walking just past our table and slowing down just enough to eavesdrop. It was just how I had intended. Is this Horizon Tech really worth what they say it is? The actor inquired, his tone a great mix of skepticism and intrigue. I leaned forward and spoke gently, making Robert strain to hear. Let's just say, the real value is hidden in the pre-launch phase. The public valuation will be 10 times what we're getting in at. I paused, then delivered the killing blow. The only way in at this stage is to be a close, trusted friend. My parents are all over it, of course. They understood the potential from day one. You know it's a solid investment when they're involved. From the corner of my eye, I saw my father's face light up with a gradual, delighted smile. He felt he was outsmarting me. He thought he was obtaining the greatest insider information. In his mind, this wasn't just about money. It was about demonstrating that he was still wiser and more connected than the son who had publicly disobeyed him. He had no notion that every word he heard was a meticulously designed falsehood, a single note in a symphony of destruction written specifically for him. He returned to his table, and I could almost see dollar signs spinning in his eyes. The trap was laid. All I had to do was wait for them to reveal it. The waiting was the most difficult part. For weeks, I lived in suspended animation, going through the motions of my existence while my whole focus was on the trap I had set. The PI provided regular updates. My folks were relocating. Fast. They met with their advisor, Gregory Finch, several times. They then met with their bankers. One fresh afternoon, my private investigator sent me a single, encrypted message. They're all in. A summary of their most recent financial transactions was attached. It was more than I had hoped for. They hadn't only invested their liquid assets. They had gone supernova, motivated by a passion of sheer, unadulterated avarice and a drive to outdo me. They sold a large amount of their stock portfolio. They took out a second mortgage on their Westchester home. They utilized their art collection. They even persuaded some of their country club pals to invest with them, offering them a piece of the action and establishing their own position as financial experts with insider knowledge of their bright son's next enterprise. They had consolidated every dime they had and could borrow, funneling it all into a sophisticated series of wire transfers to a network of offshore accounts I had established under the Horizon Tech banner, accounts that I alone controlled. They were fully exposed. Their financial mansion, once a stronghold, was become a house of cards, and I held the wind in my palms. The night before I planned to pull the trigger, I stood in my office, staring at the whiteboard. It was tangled in a labyrinth of identities, accounts, and timelines. The entire operation is exposed bare. It was a monument to my frigid rage. For a brief period, a glimmer of the old me, the sun, appeared. A wave of something heavy and black came over me. This was not a game. These were my parents. Then I remembered the ballroom. Everyone let out a loud gasp. The sea of horrified expressions. The scorching heat of my mother's palm against my cheek. The sensation of complete shame and desertion. The remembrance was a cool, clarifying splash of water. They'd chosen this course. They slapped their son in front of 500 people over a piece of property. They did not deserve my sympathy. They deserved to face the consequences of their own acts. I wiped the whiteboard, removing all traces of my strategy. It was time. I sat at my desk, my face illuminated by the light from my monitor. I made a single, untraceable, encrypted call to a journalist I knew, a tenacious financial reporter with a reputation for breaking major scoops. I offered him the tip of a lifetime, an anonymous leak about a large investment scam aimed at wealthy New York elites, complete with account numbers, transaction records, and the name of the fictitious company Horizon Tech. I gave him everything he needed to break the story wide open. Then, with a few mouse clicks, I started the final sequence. I dissolved the shell corporations. I emptied the offshore accounts and transferred the full amount, their life savings, loans, and friends' money, to a secure, anonymous trust established for charity. And then I removed all traces of Horizon Tech from the internet. The website, LinkedIn profiles, and white papers. Everything disappeared into the digital ether. The phantom I had made had vanished, but the damage it had caused was going to become very real. The following morning, the news arrived like a sonic explosion. The exposé was huge, with front-page coverage in every major financial journal. The media had a field day. Tech bubble burst, elite investors duped in Horizon Tech phantom company scam. The article described how a group of sophisticated, wealthy individuals were duped into investing their fortunes in a company that, upon further inquiry, did not exist. My parents' names appeared at the top of the list of victims. I witnessed the aftermath from the comfort of my penthouse. The phone calls began almost immediately. First, from my father's office. I didn't need the PI to tell me what was going on. I could picture the scene perfectly. Robert, red-faced, screamed into the phone at his broker, advisor, and bank. "What do you mean? The company doesn't exist." "This is Jason's company. I have all the documents. I heard it with my own ears." But the documents were forgeries, the accounts were empty, and the case was dead. Then came the news bulletins from home. A news vehicle was parked outside their immaculately groomed yard in Westchester. My mother, Diane, was recorded on tape, her face filled with sorrow and wrath as she refused to comment. Later, I caught a glimpse of her through their living room window, watching at the large screen TV as a reporter described the full scope of the financial disaster. The reporter added that the Parker family had lost all of their money, but they were also facing a big lawsuit from the bank that had granted their loans, as well as prospective litigation from the people they had duped into the scheme. They weren't just broke, they were in debt up to their eyes, and their social position had plummeted. The confrontation, or final act, has to be perfect. It needs a stage, and I knew the ideal one. A few months later, the Plaza Hotel held its annual charity event for the Children's Hospital. It was one of the most important events of the New York social season. The same ballroom, the same bunch, a perfect circle. I strolled the red carpet, the paparazzi's flashbulbs popping all around me. I was a different man than the one who abandoned this building in shame. I exuded confidence and poise, and my smile was sharp and controlled. I was a respected philanthropist and a pillar in the technology community. I spotted them from across the room. My parents. They were nearly unrecognizable. The pricey clothes had vanished, replaced by ill-fitting, off-the-rack attire. They appeared worn, their cheeks palled and etched from the strain of the last several months. They weren't real visitors, but they tried to be. They were talking in quiet, urgent tones with an event manager near the door. "We have invitations! We're Hamilton guests!" Diane begged, her voice low and reedy. The event manager, a man whose job was to remain politely unyielding, shook his head. "I'm sorry, Miss Parker. Your names are not on the list, and the credit card on file for the ticket purchase has been declined." I walked gently towards them, my footsteps silent on the thick carpet. I allowed them to see me before I talked. "Mom, Dad," I whispered, my voice calm and quiet. "What are you doing here?" They turned around, their expressions a hideous mix of shock, wrath, and a glimmer of desperate hope. Perhaps they assumed I was there to save them or clear up any misunderstandings. That hope faded the moment they noticed my eyes. "You." My mother snarled, her voice trembling with wrath that had been building for months. "You did this! You ruined us!" A frigid smile reached my lips. "Me?" I asked, my voice mild but audible in the lobby's relative silence. "You mean the same son who you slapped in this very ballroom, in front of all these same people, because he wouldn't give you his home?" My father's face, already pallid, appeared to collapse. "We lost everything," he said softly, his voice breaking. "Our house, our reputation, everything." I leaned in close enough that only them could hear me, my voice a frightening whisper against the backdrop of the gala's string quartet. "You wanted to ruin me. You tried to take my home, my dignity, my name. But you chose the wrong target. Remember what happened here." I motioned vaguely toward the ballroom. "You chose to make a mockery of my life in public. You wanted an audience to witness my humiliation." I straightened up, my voice raising slightly, just enough to get the attention of people close. "So I decided that your punishment should be just as public." Heads were beginning to turn. Guests who had watched the wedding catastrophe were watching with growing understanding. I took out a checkbook from the inner pocket of my tuxedo jacket. I hurriedly filled it out, tore it from the book, and handed it to a nearby waiter. "Here," I exclaimed, my voice ringing clear through the now quiet foyer. "A donation for the charity. Please see that it gets to the event organizer. And please announce it. I'd like it to remain anonymous." The server, perplexed, took the check and dashed to the stage within the ballroom. A few moments later, the MC's voice echoed across the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, can I have your attention, please? We've just received a breathtakingly generous anonymous donation. A special thank you to our anonymous benefactor for a donation of $2 million. A round of applause erupted from the ballroom. But my parents did not hear it. Their eyes were wide with shock and locked on me. They'd recognized the number. It was the precise projected value of my apartment. The price for their avarice. Diane's face crumbled, tears of genuine sadness running down her cheeks. You had that money the whole time, she said quietly, her voice shaking. You could have saved us. I gazed down at the two people who had given me life, then attempted to take it back. Their pompous masks had finally slipped off, exposing the fearful, sad beings beneath. They were deprived of their wealth, prestige, and pride. They had nothing left. No, Mom, I replied, my voice as hard and cold as a diamond. I could have, but I chose not to. I paused a while before administering the final, fatal blow. You sold your own son for a fake wedding gift, so I decided you should lose everything to a fake company. That's poetic justice, don't you think? I turned away from them and walked inside the gala, leaving them standing in the foyer, devastated and alone, their demise now a public show for the very audience they had earlier attempted to impress. The aftermath was calm, a gradual, unavoidable decline. Naturally, the bank's lawsuit was successful. My parents, who had no assets or income, declared bankruptcy. They lost their house in Westchester. They had lost their automobiles. They had lost the last of their fair weather buddies. The few people who had invested in Horizon Tech based on their recommendation either sued them or just removed them from their life, treating them as social outcasts. Their fall from grace was complete. A few months later, I learned from Sarah that they had moved into a small, dingy rental apartment in a less than desirable neighborhood of Queens. The image was difficult to picturing my mother, who wouldn't be caught dead in last season's Channel, living in a walk-up with peeling linoleum floors. My father, who rated a man based on the quality of his scotch, was drinking cheap canned beer. They were enduring the slow, grinding punishment of a life they had long despised. They were frequently summoned to court, suffering the penalties of loans they couldn't repay. They'd never recover. Diane, I heard, was still convinced that I would finally relent. He's my son, she allegedly cried. He wouldn't. Robert knew better. He was aware that the son they had raised had passed away. My personal new normal was quiet. I was back in my apartment, and the view of Central Park was as breathtaking as ever. But something felt odd. Colder. The victory, as full and joyful as it was, left a void in its wake. Sarah came to visit one evening. It was the first time we'd spoken in depth since the wedding. She sat on my couch, twisting a napkin in her hands while her gaze avoided mine. Jason, she began quietly, her voice full of tears. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. I informed her, my tone soft but distant. This was never about you. I did what I had to do. They broke the family, Sarah, not me. She eventually looked at me, her countenance deeply sorrowful. I know they were wrong. What they did to you was unforgivable. She drew a shuddering breath. But you've changed. There's a hardness in you now. You're so cold. A weak, almost sorrowful grin appeared on my lips. I was forced to change, I explained. They burned away the softer parts of me. It's a heavy burden, living with this kind of anger. It keeps you warm on cold nights, but it doesn't let anything else in. She didn't respond to that. We sat in silence for a long time, the city lights glittering below, two strangers who had shared a childhood, now split by a gap of my own creation. I had won the fight, but in the process, I had fortified myself so thoroughly that I wasn't sure how to let anyone back in, including her. The penthouse felt more like a fortress than a home. The victory was certainly bittersweet. I often stand by the window, looking out at the city, the viewpoint I battled so hard to establish and then to defend. They say that revenge is best served cold. And I must admit, I was overjoyed when I watched my parents' faces light up with understanding and dread. It was justice. But I also discovered that it leaves a taste in your tongue that you can never fully wipe away. My vengeance destroyed them, but it also scorched the landscape of my own life. It wasn't only their downfall. I lost all I thought I understood about family, love, and forgiveness. I had to kill a part of myself to accomplish what I achieved, and I still live with that spirit every day. Finally, no amount of money, view, or victory can fully cure that wound.